to our first part of tonight's event. Before I introduce these both properly, I'm going to just give you a little idea of the format this evening. So we're going to start off with Arusa and Katie interviewing each other about their books. Very cool. And then we're going to have a little break after some audience questions. Sorry, you will get a chance to ask questions. And then we're going to take a break. And after that, we're going to hear from some other speakers, some friends, and then some big tunes. I think that's some big tunes. That's what we've got.
Yep, yeah, big tunes.
Big tunes. So, introductions. Arusa Qureshi, do you want to? Yeah. Is a writer and editor based in Edinburgh and a passionate advocate for diversity and accessibility. Arusa Qureshi is a writer and editor based in Edinburgh and a passionate advocate for diversity and accessibility within arts and culture. She is the former editor of The List and writes mostly about music, most recently Flip the Script, which is a book that we are launching currently. Her work has appeared in The Scotsman, Clash, The Guardian, Gold Flake Paint, Time Out, Enemy, and more. In 2017, she was shortlisted for PPA Scotland's Young Journalist of the Year award and was also the winner of the Alan Wright Award for Quality Writing in Arts Journalism. She is on the board of the Scottish Music Centre and is a trustee of the Saltire Society. Katie Goh is a writer, editor, and critic based in Edinburgh. She covers culture in publications like ID, Huck, Vice, The Independent, and The Guardian, and is Intersections editor at The Skinny. In 2019, Katie was shortlisted for the PPA Scotland's Young Journalist of the Year award, and in 2021, shortlisted for the Anne Brown Essay Prize, organised by BBC Scotland and Wigtown Book Festival. Earlier this year, Katie was invited to join the UK Film Critics Circle, and she also co-hosts the monthly EHFM Culture Review radio show. Her first book, The End, Surviving the World Through Imagined Disasters, is out now. This one. Oh, this one. And you can buy both of them at the till. Yeah, I'm really excited about this event. Both of these books are wonderful. The Inklings are short essays that are deeply personal, but also, I think, universally applicable and quite resounding. They're both books about the ways in which we can find comfort in places some people may not think we can. And yeah, I'm really excited. So let's give a round of applause.
Can everyone hear me okay? Just making sure that works. This one? We're both mic'd up, you see, so we're a bit confused. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Excellent. Okay. So thank you so much, Peach, for that introduction. That was really lovely, and Katie and I are so pleased to be here and be part of this event. The Radical Book Fair is something that I'm sure we both go to all the time, and we feel kind of a bit in awe that we're on this lineup. And yeah, thank you so much to Mary and Lighthouse Books for all this amazing event just this week in general. I really wanted to do this event with Katie because neither of us likes extended amounts of solo attention.
Yep.
So we thought thought that it was better if we did it together, so we could be anxious together.
Yep.
And you know, and then invite some friends along to then be anxious with us too.
Yep.
So that's how it all came about. So for anyone who doesn't know, as Peach said, our books are part of the Inklings series. And 404 Inc., the publisher, is run by the amazing Heather McDade and Laura Jones, who are not here sadly, but wonderful people. They had this idea to create this series of non-fiction books that was basically on different themes, different topics, and they opened for submissions last year.
Yeah, October last year.
Katie and I both put in pitches. So Katie, do you want to talk about how you went about putting your pitch in and why you wanted to put a pitch in?
Sure, yeah, I think that, can everyone hear me okay? No? Okay. How close do I need to be? I'll try to project a little bit as well. Yeah, the call-out came last year, and I think 404 Inc. were kind of going through this weird time, like everyone during the pandemic, where, yeah, as a business and a publisher, they didn't really know, how things were going to be. It was kind of felt a bit like middle of the apocalypse this time last year. So I kind of had this like fascination with the end of the world for a while. So I thought, why not pitch this? And then they sort of were interested, because I think that they wanted my book is about sort of fictional apocalypses, and they wanted something that was about disaster and sort of about COVID, but not really about COVID, because that's really depressing. So that's what I did. What about you, Arusa?
Why did I pitch? I wasn't going to. It was thanks to a good friend, Kirsten, who's here somewhere. She really encouraged me to put in a pitch. I had that whole imposter syndrome thing that everyone has, where I was like, how can I write a book? Come on. But hip hop is something that's very important to me, for many reasons, which we'll talk about. And I had this idea for wanting to focus on women in particular, and I actually originally was going to focus just on Scotland, but Heather and Laura, with their infinite wisdom, encouraged me to go beyond to the UK, and I'm really glad I did, because yeah, it's been a really amazing journey, as kind of cliche as that sounds.
Yeah, it really has. And I feel like we're part of a bigger sort of series, so it does feel very much kind of like a family sort of thing. So it's been really nice to sort of do this with you and like do this event. And okay, let's like
we're pals. It's just, yeah, it's felt like a family, because we had a meet up. Maybe was it like a few weeks ago, where some of the writers who were in London, or one of the writers in London came, and it was just nice to like meet, and not over Zoom and not over the internet, and just chat and be like, we did this thing.
I
Can
know.
you believe it?
I know, and it's been so nice to sort of start doing actual in-person things and like seeing faces. Some of them are familiar, some of them are not. It's been really nice. And yeah, so I think that I'm going to start, talking a little bit about the end, and then we're going to flip the script.
Oh, I see what we did there.
And then Arusa will talk about thank you.
Yeah.
We'll talk about their book for a little bit, and then at the end there will be like 5-10 minutes maybe for some questions. So think about them, because otherwise we're going to pick people that we know to ask questions. So.
Yeah. And I've got my phone, not to be rude, but just to keep an eye on the time. Just saying. So Katie, tell us about the end, and give us a reading if you've got one ready.
Yeah, so I thought I'd read a little bit from the introduction, because I think that would probably make sense. And yeah, so my book is about fictional apocalypses, so sort of like TV, film, books that are about the end of the world, and it sort of uses fictional scenarios to talk a little bit more about like real life disaster as well, and what we can sort of learn about real disaster through these stories. So I will read a little bit. I have a bit of a sore throat, so if I sort of like fade away, then carry on without me. Be fine.
I got you.
Thank you, Arusa. The first time the world ended, I was 6 years old. People were partying like it was 1999 as news anchors and doomsayers prophesied whether or not a computer glitch would cause an apocalypse to herald in the new millennium. The problem, Y2K, was that computer programs might not be able to read dates further than 1999. It was hypothesized that calendar time could roll backwards like a taximeter to 1900, resulting in crashed planes, banking systems, and electrical grids. A Y2K software outage had been deliberated as early as the 1950s, but largely ignored until 1999 arrived. Then mass hysteria broke out. Countries established Y2K task forces, and fundamentalist religious leaders decreed that a millennium apocalypse was God's instrument to shake this nation, to humble this nation. Some panicked, some found God, but most resigned themselves to destiny and kept partying. What are we going to be doing on New Year's Eve? Well, I'm going to be hiding somewhere, Backstreet Boys member Nick Carter quipped nervously on MTV. It turns out the world didn't end on the first day of the year 2000. Computers ticked over into the new calendar year, elevators kept ascending, and a pin was put in the apocalypse. I was too young to remember much of Y2K, but I can remember with crystalline clarity the next time the world ended. 12 years after Y2K, another apocalypse was foretold, but rather than technology, this Armageddon was ancient history. A New Age interpretation of the Mayan calendar that ended on the 21st of December 2012 marked the day the Earth would undergo a transformation, which, depending on your doomsayer, could be a rapture, earth-cladding of a mythical planet, or freak weather. A conspiracy theory was whipped into a frenzy of apocalyptic prophesizing by the internet, religious zealots, and Hollywood. 2012, the wonderful disaster movie starring John Cusack was released in 2009. 1 in 7 people were polled as believing the world would end on the 21st of December 2012, and I was, depending on the day, maybe one of them. A teenager with an overactive imagination, I scoffed at the idea in conversation and spent my nights reading blogs on the elaborate mathematics of Mayan calendars. On the date itself, I took some relief that mass catastrophe hadn't been reported by New Zealanders, who surely would have dipped into the apocalypse before the rest of us. But I still waited up until midnight GMT, incessantly lighting up my BBG watch before concluding that the end was, in fact, not nigh. The next day, NASA published an article titled, "Why the World Didn't End," explaining with the patience of a high school science teacher that the apocalypse can't just be speculated into existence by anxiety-ridden bloggers. Bit cowardly, I thought, while reading it, waiting until the apocalypse doesn't happen to publish this. In the long stream of history, Y2K and 2012 are hardly special occurrences. Look back 10 years, or 100, or 1,000, and you'll find the apocalypse. The end of the world has been happening and subsequently not happening since people could make shit up. Take the Bible, the original Reddit thread, which is riddled with Armageddon. Plagues, floods, serpents of fire, and raining brimstone all features divine retribution in the Old and New Testaments. But it's the book of Revelation, the Bible's concluding book, where things take an especially apocalyptic turn. Revelation's author, John, outlines both a literal and an allegorical vision of a future rapture, when God will make the world anew after servants of evil persecute the faithful. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, prophesies John, will bring disaster, plagues, famines, and wars that will kill off 1/3 of the world's population. When all hope seems lost, God's forces will return to destroy the evil and deliver a brave new world. The book of Revelation was written during a time of war and natural disaster. Its author, John, is thought to have been a Jewish refugee who fled Jerusalem after an army of Romans decimated the city. Written 60 years after Jesus' death, John lived in apocalyptic times. Revelation is a piece of political writing, a nightmarish howl for hope in a hopeless time. The biblical book's narrative arc, disaster followed by redemption, has cemented itself as the prototypical narrative of disaster fiction, and Revelation's legacy lives on as the most influential apocalyptic tale in Christian and by extension Western culture. 2,000 years after it was written, John's archetype reveals in our fictitious visions of the end of the world. It's there in the technological anxieties of Victorian Britain's science fiction novelists, in the environmental disaster movies of the 2000s, and in our 2012 misinterpretation of a Mayan calendar that followed the then worst recession since the 1970s. During times of social upheaval, apocalyptic tales and dystopian visions become manifestations of contemporary anxieties, like H.G. Wells's alien invasion tale of colonial guilt, War of the Worlds, to Armageddon's pre-9/11 display of American bravado, to Susan Collins's widely popular The Hunger Games trilogy, published as masses of protesters took to the streets, demonstrating for civil rights, fair economic structures, and free speech across the world. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. As destructive as the apocalypse is portrayed in movies, books, and games, its original meaning implies an unveiling of the truth. It melts away the sheen of civilization to expose our basest human nature and ask, what are we at our core? Disaster lays us, our identities, behaviors, and priorities bare. Boundaries are violated as an uncertain void in our future opens up. After the end of the world, everything is possible. We can be anything, we can be nothing. Thank you.
So, as you can tell from that introduction, Katie's book is awesome, and I'm not just saying that because we're pals. It's a really, really good book, and it really made me go away and want to binge watch, binge read all this apocalyptic stuff. And I know we've talked about this before, and you mentioned why you had this fascination with the apocalypse early on. I think a lot of us can probably relate to that idea of Y2K especially. So, what made it so interesting to you, especially in the pandemic, that you thought, this is what I need to be writing about?
Yeah, I think that, March 2020, which seems like decades ago now, but was last year. I think that quite a lot of people really turned to sort of like disaster and pandemic stories. There was a stat that came out from Warner Brothers, who distributed a film called Contagion, which I write a little bit about in the book. That movie kind of jumped up to 100 places to be their most streamed film of 2020 after Harry Potter. So I think that it's not just me. I'm not just like the only person who's got this sort of weird apocalyptic fascination. I think that culturally we are very obsessed with our species ending, which is kind of strange. I think that, we kind of have this weird sort of apocalyptic desire almost, or this sort of like what if feeling. And I think it's sort of, I know that we're like of the same generation, sort of, you know, like I said in that introduction, the apocalypse has been happening and not happening for a very, very long time, since the Bible. But I think that sort of people our age have sort of grown up in this really weird time of like Y2K, 2012, but also, you know, terrible political systems, you know, populism, the climate crisis. We sort of, you know, we grew up with social media and all these sort of things. So I think that we have very much grown up sort of having this like looming apocalyptic mindset over us. So I think that that kind of has always been like festering in the back of my mind. And then whenever COVID sort of happened, and I thought, okay, well, this seems like timely enough, because obviously we're all thinking about this crisis right now, but also like what about after COVID, and also what about before COVID? Like what can we sort of learn from fictional stories that maybe we could apply to where we're kind of going, you know?
No, I was going to ask you actually about, well, first of all, I love the fact that you took it all the way back to biblical times and all the way forward to Contagion. And I was going to ask you about Contagion, because that I find so bizarre that people were so into that.
Yeah.
When, you know, all this stuff was happening. So would you say that we as human beings just have a kind of weird, morbid fascination with our mortality and the end of the world? And is that partly why people look to these kind of films and books, etc.?
Yeah, I think that we really do. I think that, yeah, but I think that's really important, because all of these sort of apocalyptic stories and all the fiction that I look at in the book, they are technically post-apocalyptic stories, but, you know, they're always about survivors. Like, they're never about the person who dies immediately, you know? Like, and I think that that's the thing, like, we like to think like, oh yeah, if I was in, you know, The Walking Dead or something, I would obviously be one of the like lead actors and survivors, but really I think most of us would be like the background extra and die immediately. So I think that we like to think of ourselves as very special. Mm-hmm. And I think that, yeah, when we sort of live in such a weird time with like humanity in general, and sort of this sort of weird sense of this apocalypse that feels like it's always coming but also never coming, that I think that we like to think of ourselves as like, we'll survive that. So I think that these sort of fictional disasters and apocalypses kind of, they make us feel quite special. And also I think that we sort of need something like this. I think like we need to sort of have a way of dealing with this sort of feeling of dread in a way that feels quite safe. So like watching a movie like Contagion, I think during the pandemic, allowed people to sort of think like, oh, maybe this weird virus that's going around will, you know, there'll be an end to it. There's sort of like this really neat 3-act Hollywood structure that's placed on crises in fiction. And obviously, it's not been quite like that in the real world. So I think that, yeah, we sort of want to have this kind of safe way of dealing with crises. So I think that's also why a lot of people sort of turn to these sort of movies during
But that's
COVID.
a really good point, that there's a beginning, middle, and end in a lot of these fictional, you know, representations of the apocalypse. And so you watch them and you feel hopeful in some way. Writing this book, do you feel hopeful generally about, you know, your kind of feelings on the apocalypse at the end of the world? I know, I haven't obviously read the book, so I know the answer to this, but I would like you to say.
Yeah, I think that actually for someone who's quite nihilistic, and for someone who's written a book about the end of the world, it actually is a very optimistic ending, which actually, like, 404 Ink didn't even make me write, so it actually was quite pleasant at the end. Yeah, I think so. I think that, like, whenever you sort of, like, I read and watched so many of these stories over and over again for like 6 months, and really sort of dived into the deep end, and like I explore a lot of like personal issues in the book as well, like my feelings around climate change and depression and anxiety and things like that. But I think that these sort of fictional stories, these stories about survivors, they're always sort of, yeah, they make you sort of think about your own life in different ways and sort of put your own life into perspective. But also, I think that there's some really great apocalyptic stories that can actually be really useful for sort of personal disaster. It doesn't have to be huge end of the world like asteroid scenarios. It can also be, they can also tell us as much about how it feels to sort of like be anxious and be, you know, a person in the world. So I think that one of the movies I look at is Arrival, which is like a space alien movie. But I sort of rewatched that during the pandemic and was like, oh, this actually tells me way more about like living with depression than like an alien invasion. So I think that, yeah, the book sort of, it looks at kind of big picture and also small picture, which I think is, I think why we like these sort of stories, because, it makes us think big and small.
Yeah. Obviously, you spoke about loads of books and loads of films throughout it, but you only have so much space. If you had more room, are there other films, other books that you would have included? I'm thinking especially now, like Squid Game.
Yeah, I really wish that I waited a few months, because Squid Game came out after I handed in the book, and the book was gone, so I didn't get a chance to. But yeah, I really would have liked to look at Squid Game, and because I think that's a really interesting example of a dystopian disaster, because it's, like, I'm guessing most people have probably watched it here. It's, it's a dystopian, but it's very, very much like our reality. Like, they leave the dystopian world and it's just normal life in South Korea, and I think that that's quite jarring, I think, to people as well. And I think it's actually a really great way of sort of looking at what we get from these sort of dystopian and disaster scenarios. Like, the fact that whenever it's sort of in this weird little dystopian world, you think that's really futuristic and really far away and not relevant to us, and then they kind of break out of that, and you're like, oh no, it's just capitalism as it is now. And I think that can be really, like, helpful. Like, that's why, Squid Game is a TV show about personal debt and about capitalism and individualism and neoliberalism, and these are really big themes, I think, for people to deal with. But actually having this sort of, like, these characters and this sort of scenario, it is a way of making you think about these issues, but in sort of a more fun way of watching people get murdered.
Spoiler alert.
A lot of people die.
I'll ask you one last thing before we move on. If you could give your book to anyone in the world and know that they were going to read it, who would it be? I just thought of this now.
What a big question, Arusa. We didn't talk about this before.
No, I just thought of it now. I'm sorry. I can give you my answer if you want.
I don't, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Because it's like, I want people to maybe think about the issues in the book, but I don't really necessarily want them to, like, read my book. But, I think maybe it's like, as everyone leaves COP26 tomorrow, they can just hand out in the goodie bags, put it out.
That would have been such a good idea.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in the book about the climate crisis, and I think that about sort of our feelings of, like, grief and terror at the climate crisis, and how we sort of can look at different, fictional environmental disaster films and what they sort of tell us about how we sort of feel about it collectively. So I think that, maybe I make them all watch The Day After Tomorrow as well.
I like it. Very good.
Yeah, so I think we're going to flip the script. And, thank you. And
also, just please do buy Katie's book, because I really do mean it when I say it's a really good book, and it's just so interesting.
Thank you. So now it's your turn to be in the hot seat.
Oh, damn.
So yeah, do you want to maybe set up sort of like what the book is about and sort of where this idea came from, and then maybe give us a little reading?
Yeah, so hip-hop is something that's really important to me, and it has been for a very long time. And it's important to me not just as a music genre, but as a kind of movement, as a part of culture. And it's probably easier if I read now to explain exactly why I wanted to write this book, rather than just chatting rubbish. So I'm gonna read just from the introduction, and let me just put my phone down. And actually, just before I do read, my book was dedicated to a friend called Lucy Monroe, and I just really wanted to mention her name and acknowledge her, because she was a really good friend and a colleague who passed away last year, and I couldn't write a book about amazing women without dedicating it to the most amazing woman I ever had a chance to be friends with. So I just really wanted her to be a part of this somehow. So yeah, Lucy. Okay, so my introduction is called Bad Bitch Alert.
Hey.
Moving on the tone. Okay, I'm not going to read very much because I don't want to bore everyone. So, hip-hop is an art form that originated in the margins and can be simultaneously devastating and celebratory, an expression of pain, love, and desire, or an ode to the other, the underdog, and the underground. It is empowerment and subversion, but also full of contradictions and unresolved controversy. It's all of these things and much more. For me, though, it's the crucial association with social movements, revolutionary campaigns, and cultural awareness, as well as protest and activism that proves that hip-hop can be a safe haven, especially for the oppressed. Hip-hop has always been something of a safe haven for me. Many would likely consider this an unusual statement to make, with a phrase like safe haven perhaps viewed as the antithesis to hip-hop. But creatively, mentally, and emotionally, it's been the place that I've landed throughout my adult life when my mind is in desperate need of a boost. My own connection to hip-hop was forged in the 90s and early 2000s, where I grew up with a music taste largely defined by an older sister who gravitated towards R&B and hip-hop as a teenager. I remember vividly dancing around our living room while MTV blasted out music videos by the likes of TLC, Biggie, and Aaliyah, just a few of our favorites. One of my earliest memories of my little brother also strangely revolves around the genre. Struggling to sleep as a newborn, we soon discovered that he had a natural fascination with the aforementioned music videos. So my sister taped a random selection that were on heavy rotation, including Tupac's Changes, Missy Elliott's Get Your Freak On, and Outkast's Miss Jackson. And my brother would be gently rocked to sleep against the soothing backdrop of gangster rap and alternative hip-hop. This unorthodox method would have him snoring away in less than 15 minutes, and so began the legacy of the tape. It's a real thing, I promise. Why my fairly traditional Muslim South Asian mother encouraged this, I'll never fully understand, but I think she secretly really liked Missy Elliott. We were the type of first-generation immigrant kids that naturally rebelled against our parents' desire to assimilate into South Asian heritage, and so we looked to music and TV instead for a different cultural fix. We brushed off Bollywood in favor of American hip-hop and shunned our parents' Asian sitcoms and soaps for The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Sister Sister. Black American culture spoke to us, and growing up in Scotland with very few brown people around, it was our only immediate bridge to other people of colour. Sure, it wasn't our culture and it wasn't about our experiences, but there was something in hip-hop in particular that made me feel like it was okay to be the only brown person in the room. My own teens were dominated by an all-consuming love for Nirvana and everything grunge, but in the background, hip-hop was always there. When I was around 15, I started writing, mostly silly poems and rambling essays about music, but I was also obsessed with pulling apart lyrics, trying to really understand what was being said and why. The golden age of hip-hop was where I found most comfort, and at this point, the stylistic innovations, eclectic cadences, and fast rhymes of the era drawing me in like no other form. This deep-seated interest never left me, only intensifying as I learned more about the originators and pioneers of the genre, as well as what was happening in the present in contemporary hip-hop. It all reached a climax at university. I took my interest a step further and wrote my undergrad dissertation on the form. Studying English literature, hip-hop came up in exactly one slide in one lecture on vernacular poetry. But that was all the permission I needed. Sadly, my supervisor did not see it that way. He encouraged me to switch topics, commenting, "I don't understand the point of hip-hop. I don't mind Jay-Z too much, though." There were no people of color on the department's teaching staff, and I felt as if I wasn't being taken seriously with my lofty hip-hop academia. Being determined and desperate to stick it to the man who dismissed me, I went for it anyway, and the topic, defiance in hip-hop. I've never felt as passionate about researching and writing something as I did that dissertation, and it sparked a lifelong dream to write about music professionally and academically, which leads me quite nicely to the title of this introduction, Bad Bitch Alert. In 2015, I was commissioned to write my first article for the List magazine. The article, Bad Bitch Alert, was my take on how female MCs, including Lizzo and LaKelly47, were challenging hip-hop's male reign. Women have occupied a vital space in hip-hop from its very beginnings in the Bronx in the 70s, but men have always dominated in one way or another, with gendered hierarchies becoming ingrained in the genre itself. I was lucky in that I was exposed to everyone from Salt and Pepper and Left Eye to Queen Latifah and Missy Elliott early on, thanks to my older sister. Women were very much a big part of everything I knew about hip-hop, and in many ways the reason I started falling for hip-hop in the first place. Seeing not only people of colour but women of colour on screen, powerful, confident and completely in control, contributed to what I believed was possible for us growing up. It contributed to my idea of the safe haven. It was obvious, though, in terms of the videos that were being played on the loop on MTV and the rappers that were climbing the charts, who was ruling the roost. I didn't care, though. Before I knew anything about misogyny or stereotypes, hip-hop was female empowerment epitomized. When I came to write that article, armed with years of research and analysis on the precarious relationship between women and hip-hop over the past few decades, I really did believe that something was changing in the pecking order. I still do all these years later, but crucially, it's not just changing where it all began in the US. I'll stop there. Da da da.
Thank you so much. I love your book so much. I feel like I learned about the entire history of hip hop in the UK, really, reading it, and it's so wonderful because you're so passionate about the subject, and it really shines through in your writing. And this feels really important as well. Is this like the only book about female hip hop in the UK, or?
I don't know, but there's loads of amazing hip hop academics that are working in the area, in the US in particular, people like Trisha Rose and Mamani Perry and Dreamhampton, people that I've read a lot of. In the UK, there's similar amazing academics. Even in Scotland, actually, Dave Hook, who's aka Solar Eye from Stanley Odd, he's a professor of hip hop at Napier, and he's acknowledged my book because he was a big help. People are definitely studying it and talking about it, but I could not find a huge amount about women in the UK in hip hop. And just generally, even online articles, there isn't much there, which is really sad.
Yeah, but I think that also speaks to how important this book is, and that this is so vital for the history of music, which is really wonderful. And I suppose your book's quite a little bit different from mine because you interviewed a lot of people for yours. Maybe do you want to talk a little bit about that process and sort of how that was? Did you interview any of your heroes and that kind of thing?
Yes. So when I put the pitch into Inklings to do the Inklings book, I said from the very start that I wanted to be based around interviews, just because I wanted to tell stories using people's words who were actually there, rather than, interpreting it my way. I wanted to be able to include their stories as is. And so I had a big, huge list of people I wanted to interview, ridiculous. And even Heather and Laura said, you're not going to be able to do this. And they were right. Obviously, I didn't have that much time, so I had to narrow. I did actually try. I contacted everyone, but I was left with the women in the book who I'm so glad that they gave up their time to speak to me, because it was right at the start of the year when everyone was kind of zoomed out and nobody really wanted to speak, and I don't blame them at all. And they all gave so much of their time and were just so lovely. And yeah, I definitely got to interview some of my heroes. Cookie Crew was probably the big one, because they're one of the first women in hip hop in the UK, and I was so nervous, and that was the one I kind of fangirled over the most. But they sat and chatted for 3 hours or something, and this is Debbie and Susie from Cookie Crew, and they were so nice, and they were so just open and willing to tell me about all the shit they went through, as well as all the really amazing stuff. And that was a really amazing moment. And other people Speech Devel, that was a big one, I love her, and Annie, who's a kind of current favourite. But Cookie Crew was the one, and actually just this week Debbie sent me an email with a picture of a pile of books that she'd bought and said some really lovely things. So
that's really sweet.
It just shows it's women supporting women.
Yeah, amen. Amen. And I suppose because you did all these interviews, but you'd already pitched this book, I was just wondering, how did those interviews sort of shape your initial ideas around the book? Did you sort of change it a lot, or did it sort of stay true to what you had originally had in plan?
I think it stayed true in terms of it being a kind of, I knew from the beginning it was going to be a love letter rather than it being a proper history and a deep dive, because I'm not an academic and I don't want to, I don't want to pretend to do that. This is my love letter and my kind of appreciation of all these amazing women. So I knew from the beginning what the structure would be, but one thing I really wanted to do was make sure it wasn't London focused. Mm-hmm. So that's why there's such a big focus on regional areas, on Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And that was, I actually wish I had more words. I could have amped that up a bit, because that's the bit that I really, could write a whole separate book on probably.
Yeah.
Because there's so much incredible stuff happening in all regions of the UK, and I think that's where the real innovation is, and that's kind of what excited me to begin with, to be honest.
Yeah, I love that chapter so much, and in it you sort of note that last year was really significant because Nova won the Say Award for Best Album, and who was it that won the Welsh equivalent? Daya won it. So these sort of incredible female rappers winning these sort of regional awards that have historically been quite white and male dominated. That feels really significant. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that moment and what you sort of think that moment meant for women in hip hop generally in the UK.
So that was probably the reason I actually did put in the Inklings pitch, because two women in hip hop winning those two regional prizes in the same year, maybe it's a coincidence, but to me it didn't feel like it and they were the first rappers to win those awards. It was the Welsh Music Prize and the Scottish Album of the Year award. And I just thought it signaled something that was changing, not just in terms of, the public's appreciation of hip hop, but also the industry and the people that are in charge actually taking it seriously as a genre. And more than anything, it just highlights exactly what I said from the beginning, that, hip hop in the different regions outside of London, outside of England, it's just amazing, and it's booming in such a way that we need to pay attention to it.
Yeah, definitely. And we are at a radical book fair. And you talk a lot in the book about how hip hop is obviously very sort of intertwined with political movements. I was wondering, if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and sort of that history. Was that something that really fascinated you, the sort of like the social sort of, side of hip hop and what hip hop has meant to a lot of political movements?
Yeah, the reason I love hip hop so much is because it has soundtracked so many political and social movements in the past. And if we take it right back to the beginning, in the Bronx in the 70s, yes, hip hop was about music you could dance to and have a good time to and party to, but it was also music that talked about poverty and racial injustice and police brutality and all those themes. And at its core, hip hop it's an African American art form that is about marginalized experience. And even though it's morphed and it's traveled the world and it's changed and there's so many different offshoots, at its core, that is still what it is, which is why I think hip hop is such a great genre to soundtrack social movements. And we saw it in like the 90s with people like, I think the first ever hip hop track officially that was political was this track by Brother D and Collective Effort in 1980 called How Are We Gonna Make the Black Nation Rise? And that kind of is what's kicked off the whole, really being openly political in your raps. And so people like Public Enemy, that's, where you can trace Public Enemy back to Brother D and Collective Effort. But then all the way to modern day, we've got people like Kendrick Lamar, and the hip hop movement definitely is a soundtrack to Black Lives Matter. It really is. And I think part of it is because, again, of it being that kind of poetry of marginalized experience. And it's not that rapping is necessarily easy, but it's accessible. Anyone can rap. Anyone can write a rap, and that's why it soundtracks so many important political and social movements and activism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. They're like, anyone can write a rap, but not everyone should.
Yeah.
Speaking from experience.
Yeah, me too. That's why I write about hip hop.
I suppose I wanted to sort of finish up with my final question. You sort of, whenever you were reading from the introduction earlier, you mentioned that professor who, was quite dismissive of hip hop as a literary art form. Do you think that it is getting sort of reappreciation, and how do you sort of think that criticism around hip hop sort of stands now?
So academically, I don't know. Like if I was to write that dissertation now, I don't know if it'd be any different. Obviously, like I said, there's so many amazing academics working in the field who are writing great stuff. I don't know how seriously it's taken as poetry. I think there's a difference in America. So there's a really significant moment for me was when Kendrick Lamar won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for Damn. That was a huge thing because it just showed that hip hop was being acknowledged as a true poetic art form. And people were grumpy about it and people made all kinds of comments, whatever. It happened and it was great. And maybe it's because obviously hip hop originated in America, so it's more natural for it to be kind of taken seriously there. But in the UK, I think it's been a bit slower in terms of seeing it as poetry. But it's happening, and just to give you an example, I took part in this amazing festival a few weeks ago called Push the Boat Out in Summerhall, and the team there made sure that hip hop was a big part of the festival. So I was there to do an event on hip hop, and more poetry festivals and book festivals should have hip hop as a big part of it because, again, it's poetry, it's modern day poetry on marginalized experience.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the end of my questions. If we want to give Arusa a round of applause. And I think we have some time for some audience questions if you want to pitch. Yes, hello.
I'm coming to you. Not
shape your relationship to the topic. So if you go like to the end of it, like I never want to see a political movie, I never want to listen to that stuff, or if you like just started a lot of more conversation for yourself and you were like, oh, there's more stuff that I want to analyze and now you want to write more about it. Can we just repeat the question?
Yep.
Otherwise it won't end up on the live stream.
Good point. The question was, were we fed up of our topics at the end of it, or did we want to explore more and do more with them? For me, the problem with Inklings, I went far over my word count, like really, really far over my word count. And Heather and Laura, bless them, really helped me cut it down and brought it to a place that I was really happy with it. But I could have written so much more. And that was because I was doing so much reading and researching all the way through that, yeah, my appreciation for hip hop just really grew. I definitely got more angry in terms of the kind of erasure of these women that I've spoken about in the book. And like Katie asked me about, how much there is out there. Not much, and that really, really bothered me. That, I was telling these stories and, there's maybe a few mentions of some of these women online, but hardly anything. And they're huge parts of the hip hop story in the UK. Like, where have they gone? Why have people just allowed these women to disappear? So, yeah, angry, but also, yeah, very interested.
For me, I kind of got sick of all the apocalypses, but I think that there's because so much of the book is about politics and the climate crisis and sort of social issues and things like that, that is huge, obviously, and I really had to cut back on a lot of that sort of stuff, especially around environmental things and the climate, because I really could have gone on for a very long time, and we were like, it's a bit depressing, isn't it? Like, maybe we just trim it back a little bit. So yeah, I think that sort of side of things, that I really wanted to explore that maybe more, and I think I probably will down the line. But yeah, I got to the end of reading all these like end of the world zombie scenarios, and I was like, I really could do with like a rom-com or something like that, or a comedy. So
That's your next book?
Yeah,
Rom-coms.
it's just rom-coms. I know, that would be quite nice. Thank you for your question. I think the person in the black, yeah, hello, you had a question.
So firstly, thank you both so much for coming and speaking tonight. It's been great to listen to you both. Like really fascinating stuff, so thank you. But my question is specifically for Katie. So you touched on, like, there have been apocalyptic scenarios being written for literal thousands of years, and I was just wondering, like, why do you think this has been such a persistent theme in culture for so long? Because, like, you definitely gave me a very brilliant explanation for why it's so pertinent now, but it seems like people have been talking about the end of the world for as long as there have been people. So, like, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, that question was sort of about why we're being obsessed with the apocalypse for so long. I think that, yeah, it's really interesting. I think that the book references a lot of sort of more modern fictional apocalypses, because just that's who I am, and that's the sort of writer I am, and also that's who I was really writing for, as people probably around my age. But I went to an event at a book festival recently, and there was sort of an older audience, and someone asked, well, it was more of a comment than a question. They sort of talked a little bit about their experience sort of like with like the Cold War, and like, how they all thought they were going to die then as well. So I think that, we sort of think that things have gotten bad recently, but things have been bad for a very, very long time. It's not really a new phenomenon, like terrible things happening in the world, like, history, if we, full of bad stuff. So I think that these sort of stories have been around for that reason. And I think that we do have a tendency to be like, oh, this all is to do with like the current moment and what's happening right now. But actually I think that, every generation has had its apocalypse. And I think that's why, like War of the Worlds, for example, it's been adapted so many times throughout history since the novel was first released, like in the late 1800s, I think. So I think that like that story spoke as much to sort of the, colonialism of Tasmania as it does to sort of a post 9/11 American audience, which is what the Tom Cruise one is very much about. So I think that, yeah, we're just always sort of fascinated with whether or not we're going to survive and make it through. So, yeah.
Good answer.
the front.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful and energizing, both of you. I have a question for Katie as well, just because I don't know much about music. But I really, if I think about apocalypse fiction, it feels like there are the ones like Independence Day, which very much seems like shore up existing power structures. So you have like the state and you have the military. And then you have like other ones which are more like Children of Men, which kind of offer this resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just interested in what you think about kind of that tension within the genre.
Yeah. So the question was about tension within the genre between sort of, I guess, disaster fiction sort of reinforcing existing sort of power dynamics, or whether they sort of shake them up a little bit. Is that right? Yeah, that's something that I find a lot with the genre. I find that most of the popular fiction is really conservative. It's really, you know, it like, especially when it comes to sort of things like gender roles, you know, women have not had a good time in fictional apocalypses. They do not last very long. There's a reason why there's sort of like the last man scenario, because they kind of just go off and do their own thing. And I think that, yeah, it's interesting. I think that a lot of mainstream sort of disaster fiction is a little bit, it does sort of reinforce a lot of things, like something like A Quiet Place, you know, great film, but it like very much sort of reinforces the like heteronormative nuclear family as sort of, you know, it survives the end of the world when like nothing else does, which I think is quite depressing. So that's like, there's like that sort of side of things, and then there's a lot of other works that I think, you know, people of color, you know, and women and queer people and people who have been historically marginalized, it feels like the end of the world all of the time. And I think that whenever writers like that are sort of playing with scenarios in disaster fiction, that's when really interesting stuff happens. So like Parable of the Sower, which is by Octavia Butler, that's, you know, one of my favorite sort of disaster fictions, because it's about this young black woman called Lauren. I think it's set maybe next year or this year, I can't remember now. But it's like, it's a book that first has the phrase "Make America Great Again" in it, and it was released in the 80s, you know, so it feels very, very relevant. And that book is about, you know, what happens whenever a populist president comes in, and what happens whenever the climate collapses and people, you know, like, it feels very relevant right now. So I think, and you know, that book is so much about community, and it's about bringing different people who are very vulnerable within that world together. So like those of mixed race couples and young mothers and young women, they all sort of band together and they make this community. And I think that sort of found family idea is a lot more helpful than maybe sort of the idea that like, oh yes, the suburban nuclear family will survive. So yeah, that is my feelings on it. Thank you for your question.
Oh, I should have thought about this one before. Shouldn't I?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, it was, what am I listening to right now? Would I recommend an album? What am I listening to right now? Okay, I'm going to recommend Scottish hip-hop because, you know, why not? I believe strongly in the Scottish hip-hop scene, and that we're in a really good place. Still work to be done, but there's some really incredible artists. Some of my favourites are Bems. Check Bems out. Clarissa Woods, she's brilliant. Obviously Nova, we talked about. Who else is there? There's so many. Chef. Those are just, I'll give you 4. Those are 4 people to check out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're really great. Really, really good.
Great.
Yeah.
We have another question in that general area. Don't think we can come all the way there.
Hi. Oh. Yeah. So Kirsten asked the question I asked Katie earlier: if there was somebody that I could give my book to that would read it, who would it be? My person is Chuck D, because he's my hero. I love him so much. If anyone knows Chuck D, please set us up. Yeah, it's like my dream to interview him one day. I'd love him to read it because of the influence that he's had on hip-hop, but in particular political hip-hop and activism. And I'd really like an American, somebody like Chuck D, to read about UK women, because, like I said, there's just not enough out there about them, and they're an important part of the story. And, you know, yes, hip-hop originated in America, but it's a big part of UK culture too, and I just love for more people to know about the women. So Chuck D would be one. Another would be that supervisor I had at uni. I'd really like him to.
Yeah, I think we could arrange that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should do
In
that.
fact, I'm sure a lot of people in here probably know him, so we'll chat afterwards.
Surprise, he's here. He's back. I think that's probably all we have time for.
Yeah,
If anyone has any questions that they just like to ask us, not on stage, you can just do that. We will be doing some signings, I think, somewhere over
I think
at the back there.
Yeah.
And also, we'll be back in about 15-20 minutes with some incredible readers who are going to read their own work that's sort of loosely connected to our books. So we're really, really excited to have them here. And after that, we're all going to have a little dance, because Arusa's going to DJ. It's very exciting. So yeah, if everyone, the bar is open, you can go and have a drink, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Really
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.